something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Hello and welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today my guest is Lawrence Wilkerson. If he needs more of an introduction, not only is he a retired U.S. Army colonel, but he was also former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Professor Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, it's great to have you back here.
Good to be with you, Aaron.
So there's a lot of craziness going on as ever. These last few years have been really intense, and I think that we are more or less living through the twilight of U.S. imperialism, which means really centuries of Western imperialism. It's frightening, disorienting, exciting, alternatively. But I guess we could start at Israel and Gaza and Iran. We have now Israel making these noises that they must retaliate for Iran's rather understated retaliation. Where do you see this going in the next few weeks? Or do you think that Israel is going to launch a large attack on Iran? Or do you think that the U.S. will try to restrain them? Or will the U.S. pretend to restrain them, but secretly, hope that there's a war with Iran? I really can't make heads or tails of what the U.S. logic is here.
Nor can I on any daily basis. I think what I see, though, fundamentally is Biden having laid some sort of line down for Netanyahu. I think the official position of the president right now is if you do conduct another attack on Iran, we're not with you. So we'll see what that means. I think this is a very, very intriguing situation for a military professional. First of all, let me start by saying David Cameron made an absolute ass of himself yesterday, trying to compare the two attacks, Israel's clandestine and murderous attack on Iranian sovereign territory, albeit within Syria, and the absolutely harmless, really, in terms of human life and major asset destruction of Iran, which took some true operational finesse that I don't think anyone, particularly the IDF, thought Iran possessed. So they put all these remotely piloted vehicles, RPVs we call them, up in the air, every degree of sophistication virtually, every degree of cost, but not a lot of cost. And Israel expended somewhere around $1.2 billion and us about $2 billion, and Jordan and Egypt maybe a little more to bring them down. Not only did Iran gather enormous intelligence about how the IDF would react to a swarm attack like this, they also conducted a picture book perfect operation. They warned through our CIA, the United States, that they would not hit any U.S. property, period. They did not. And that's hard to do because we've so many places in Israel we now co-occupy with them, to include a base with the Stars and Stripes flying on it for the first time since 1948, and absolutely verboten as far as the military was concerned when I was there, because it meant if Israel were attacked, we were attacked. And it meant in for a penny, in for a pound. So really a picture book orchestration of military assets to do no real damage, but to say very, very astutely and smartly, and I think effectively, look at what we can do if we want to. And imagine if we had done this with our best stuff, a much bigger swarm, and we'd ask Hezbollah to swarm 50 or 60,000 of their 100,000+ missiles too, you would be dead, many of you, and you would have destruction and mayhem all across Israel. After all, you're not very big. So it was an incredible feat by Iran, I think, and I think one of the reasons we put General McKenzie out, former commander of U.S. Central Command, idiot in my view, to downplay this and to say it was a farce, because they didn't hit anything, didn't kill anybody, didn't blow anything up, or Cameron to compare the two things. When Israel's attack was covert, not broadcast to anyone, and killed people. 30 or so people were killed, including some Iranian generals. So there's no comparison between the breach of international law, if you will, that both countries could be said to have made, because they're not officially at war with one another. But Iran came out on the top of this, no question about it. And I guarantee you that Beijing and Pyongyang and Moscow are all watching this and chortling in their beer, as it were.
Right, and I would wonder how much technical assistance they've all provided. I mean, the between the cruise missile or the missile technology, or just some of the tactical, advice. Do you think that the Russians, they all seem to, it seems clear to me that Russia and China have a interest, and they've said that they will try to safeguard Iranian sovereignty if they come under, attack that seeks to destroy the Iranian, government. Do you think that the Russians and Chinese are offering any technical assistance here as they plan these things, and that these are done in consultation with them? Because I imagine they are, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about it.
I think,
Let me ask that first, and then I have a follow up related to
I
the
think
nuclear issue.
unquestionably they are. And it's not just the S-400s, which are at least testified to by several authorities better than anything we have, that they've sold to the Iranians. And Israelis will find that out if they put F-35s or whatever in there trying to suppress them. They will be suppressed if they're as good as the billing of them is. But they've also, in real terms now, Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, and Pyongyang are in alliance. And that means that they're not just in alliance and saying, we don't like you, US. We don't like your global hegemony. We don't like your ideas. We don't like anything about you. Because what you are is really a predatory capitalist state masquerading as a democracy. So first, stop talking about democracy because you're not one. And second, quit accusing us of the things you're most guilty of. So they're together now. And that means sharing weaponry. They've already done that. I think Kim Jong-un can now hit New York City. Thank you very much. He did that principally because Joe Biden told the South Korean president, if you don't send those 500,000 artillery rounds to Ukraine, you're going to have trouble in the alliance. So he did. Well, Kim Jong-un went to Moscow, and now he has the finest plutonium, the finest warheads, and the finest tracking devices, and the finest accuracy. He has state-of-the-art ballistic missiles. China is probably going to build out to what it thinks is absorb a first strike and retaliate majorly ability with its nuclear weapons. It's always gone by Mao Zedong's philosophy. I don't want any more than I need for deterrence. So they never had more than 400, 500 maybe. Now they're going to build out to 2,000 or 3,000, maybe even try to match Moscow and us. And they're getting help from Moscow in doing that because they don't have really first-class plutonium. They have uranium. Moscow has first-class plutonium, almost as good as Japan's. This is a crazy thing we've done. We've forced these four countries into not a tacit alliance now, but a recognizable alliance where they're sharing weaponry and philosophies and so forth. They've got to be circumspect, and Russia was circumspect. The message from Lavrov and others was that if Iran were to make a major attack on Israel, don't count on Russia being with them, because they understand that if that happens, the United States will be in, which is what Netanyahu wants. That's the reason Netanyahu is poking his fingers in Iran's eyes and in Hezbollah's eyes, because he wants the United States in the war to deal with his two prominent enemies, both of whom, if they attacked him together, would destroy him and destroy Israel. He wants to bring the United States in to end that threat, totally wipe that threat out. So that's his ultimate strategic aim. I think there are some other people in Likud who may agree with him in regards to what he's doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But they don't agree with him on jeopardizing Israel's future that gravely. So we may see Netanyahu take a hike soon. I wouldn't be surprised even. He orchestrated the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, just as if he'd gone out and handed the settler the pistol and said, "There he is, go shoot him." I wouldn't be surprised if somebody decided to take Bibi out, not because of what he's doing in Gaza, but because of what his predicament, his existential predicament, going to jail, leaving power, it might make him do. And I think Benny Gantz understands that. He agrees with him philosophically. I think that's the sad thing here. He agrees with the extermination of as much of Gaza as possible, and Ben Gvir going in and beginning to build settlements even in Gaza. But I don't think he believes in risking Israel's future that desperately. And so I wouldn't think Netanyahu would live past that day. And for that reason, I say I don't think we're going to see anything in response from Israel to this latest attack by Iran, but attacks on Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria, and maybe some things that they have elsewhere. I don't think you're going to see an attack on Iran proper. I may be wrong. I've said yesterday on an interview, I said, you remember the Roman 10th Legion at the foot of Masada and those Jewish fighters up there all committing suicide? That's what we're dealing with.
Right, and it seems that is where it can go. If I don't see where it can go if they attack Iran in any positive way, because with conventional weapons, as you say, they do seem to they're not defenseless, and they have those air defense systems, so it could be a real debacle, and a nuclear attack would be a disaster. Do you think that it's possible that there are nukes in Iran that Russia would put? I mean, they have a relationship there. They could likely put in. The U.S. used to do this in Japan. They weren't supposed to have nuclear weapons there, but they did routinely. Ellsberg has written about this, and
yes,
so there's no reason.
Other countries too, like the East Germans feared the West Germans, and the West Germans feared America from the point of view that they knew we would be overwhelmed conventionally through the Fulda Gap, the group of Soviet forces, Germany, 10 motorized, mechanized, armored divisions pouring through the Fulda Gap, and that we would nuke them. And it was, they would say this, both East and West, they would say, it's our territory. They knew that was our strategy, that we were going to use nuclear weapons on that vanguard of Soviet attack through the Fulda Gap. The West Germans in particular were angry about it, but they knew that was what was going to happen. And you're right. Nuclear weapons in a scenario like this find with some people, including some military leaders in the West, more utility than you would think.
That is definitely what frightens me, because if they do not attack Iran, if there is no war with Iran, it seems that the balance of power in the region, and really the flow of history, is such that this Israel project, this insane greater Israel pipe dream that they went for, and the Rabin assassination seems to be a part of that story, and it takes place at an important time when I think things were up for grabs, when people like H.W. Bush, who was a realist, wanted a two-state solution, because I believe he saw that if you rely on just pure coercion and violence, which is what the neocons and the super pro-Israel people wanted, you would unite the world against the U.S. You would damage the empire. In my opinion, the brutal and exploitative and predatory empire that H.W. Bush was fine with fronting, you would be damaging that. So I don't think H.W. Bush was any kind of humanitarian or good or benevolent statesman, but he actually realized that what the neocons wanted was stupid, and it would jeopardize the U.S. This going for just total domination and coercion you generate too much opposition. So that's where they are now, though. We're at a place where other people who were not hippies at all, like not nice bleeding heart people, said this is a catastrophe waiting to happen, and here we are decades later, and they were ignored, and now here we are.
Yeah, and Biden apparently, either out of senility, his own beliefs, or a combination of the two, seems to have bought it hook, line, and sinker. I agree with you. 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, when Condi Rice, then National Security Advisor, put out finally, I started out writing it, the National Security Strategy, the new National Security Strategy for the first George W. Bush administration. And I just gave up because it never would come back from the NSC that there was any vibrancy there about what I wrote. Well, she contracted it out. She gave it to these people, those people, Bill Crystal guy, all this crew of neocons and such. We finally got a copy of it. Powell asked me what I thought of it. I said, "Can we talk in the office alone?" Sure. I came in there. I said, "I don't like this at all." He said, "Yeah, well, your version got rejected." I said, "I didn't get rejected. I never heard a word. I don't like it because it says we're going to be the hegemon of the world." "Where does it say that?" he said. "Have you read it, boss?" And I read him a few passages and I said, "Let me paraphrase it for you. It says we're on the top of the world's mountain. Any rat or mole or snake or anything that stirs the leaves at the bottom of the mountain, we're going to bomb the bejesus out of them and sanction them. That's what we're going to do." I said, "Do you know how long it'll take the world to band together to defeat us, to balance us, and then defeat us? No more than about 20 or 30 years. It'll happen. I guarantee you. This is absurd if we make this our strategy." Do you remember what H.W. Bush did with Paul Wolfowitz's version of this when he wrote it back in
Yeah.
the administration of George H.? He said, "Send it back to the crazies in the basement of the Pentagon." Well, that's
And
what
they leaked
you
it.
should have done, Mr.
They leaked
Secretary.
it. They leaked it too. That's, I think, the key. That's the way that these political wars are fought, with leaks, and they
Yeah.
leaked it. And the Times
Well,
even
it
wrote
was
at the
sort of the
time.
foundation of the PNAC document,
Yeah.
Project for New American Century document.
And
And
Wolfowitz was one of the people who drafted in between PNAC and the Wolfowitz manifesto. You had the Clean Break document, which was
yeah,
commissioned by Beebe, and it was Beebe who had his followers kill Rabin, who was the last guy to be entertaining a two-state solution. I mean,
exactly.
it all seems to have been motivated in large part. I think that there's an alliance. I don't think it's purely Zionism. There's an alliance between corruptible, belligerent, bellicose fellows like Cheney and Rumsfeld. There's a non-Zionist centric neocon side, but they all banded together. They have their own neocon international that they put together, and they were working on that since the Ford days. Really, they've been moving in this direction.
And I think 9/11 gave him a real new lease on life. Not just the AUMF, which, by the way, is still in force. We are still fighting terrorists in Africa and everywhere else we want to fight them, and using the AUMF that we passed for 9/11 as the congressional authority to do so. What a bunch of cowards in the Congress. I mean, from my Senator Tim Kaine, who's knows better, I've had conversations with him, to Jack Reed and the Senate Armed Services Committee. They're just a bunch of cowards. They're just a bunch of cowards. They have no moral courage whatsoever. It's all political. Oh no, you can't back off any of this stuff now that we've started it. Can't back off of it because we'll be held responsible by our voters if we back off of it. Oh, you mean you'll quit making your money out of the military-industrial complex? That's what you really mean. We're going over there, General Leach and I, in a couple of weeks to talk about what's happening to the armed forces. They're just destroying themselves. The Navy doesn't have enough people to sail its ships. The Air Force doesn't have enough people to man its planes. The Army has actually asked the Congress to reduce, I didn't think I'd ever see this in my life, its in-strength authorization because they don't want to be so embarrassed when they can't recruit. The propensity of American youth is 9%, 9% to be recruited. They're spending billions of dollars on it and still falling short every year now. The only service that hadn't fallen short is the Marine Corps, and that's because they have, I think, a sort of special mystique and they don't have a big recruiting target. Even the Coast Guard is having trouble recruiting. Several generals and colonels and I sat down the other day and we said, what would happen if someone were to attack us? I said, well, 50% of American youth in draft age category, 18 to 24, would go across the Mexican border, and the other 50% would go across the Canadian border almost instantly. I
Yeah, I mean,
laugh.
how would you convince people to, I feel like the general sense is across the board that that the government, the flag that the government that the flag represents just does not represent these people or their interests. I mean, I
No,
don't, it's hard to understand precisely why the youth are so, against being part of the military, except that they should be against the military because what is the military's goal for reason for existing? What they're not trying to protect a country. It's clear that it is a global empire that benefits not them. I think
that's
that
what
that
comes.
realization is taking hold.
That's what comes back at me from my students, and something I didn't think I'd ever do. The last 3 or 4 years that women marry, and now when I have the opportunity, when a young person comes to me, no matter how promising they might be and how much I would like to see them go here or there in the armed forces, I tell them don't go, especially if they're females. I had a young lady the other day who asked me, brilliant student, very attractive girl too, and I said, think about this: you're moving between your bivouac area and your latrine area, and it's night, 2 a.m. in the morning, you've got to go, and you're moving, and you get assaulted and raped. And the guy who assaults you and rapes you is the guy who's going to be in the foxhole next to you the next morning should you go into combat. That happens? Yes, ma'am. More than you might think, more than the military attests to, but even they attest to about 25%. A woman in the military for 3-year tour is going to get sexually assaulted at a minimum with a possibility of about 80%. Harassed, 95%. Raped, no one will say, but I think it's probably in the category of 25 to 30% possibility. So I told her, don't go in. Just don't go in. That's my. You're a 31-year veteran of the Army, and you're telling me not to go in. I'm telling you not to go in. Told my grandson, my 17-year-old grandson, the same thing.
Right. I
And
mean, what has been the last
that's
war
a
or military
that's a
conflict that you
big
can actually feel good about? I mean, that
well,
you
that's
feel
that's
was
a big
worthwhile.
part of what's happened to recruiting is military families and their offspring, so to speak, were the most ripe target for being recruited. Now military families have fallen off the charts. They're advising their young people, their grandchildren and such not to go in. And you're right, that's the reason. What have we done with our military killing people, wounding people, putting people into refugee status that benefited America? Other than the military industrial complex. Oh, yeah, Lockheed Martin made a fortune, Raytheon, Halliburton, but you don't work for Raytheon, nor do I. That's the kind of advice. So why go in? Why go in and kill people for nothing? Smedley Butler comes to mind. I was a criminal for capitalism on 2 continents. I was a Medal of Honor winner twice. I was a Marine. I was a 2-star general. I'm testifying to you, Congress, in the 30s, that I was a criminal for capitalism on 2 continents. Well, now Smedley would say all it is criminality for capitalism.
Right, because he took over at that time period. I mean, he rose in the military in the period, those decades after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. had decided that rather than focus on domestic production and consumption, and try to have something of a more planned economy. I think that was more because you'd have to with no frontier. They just went for empire, and it's like that's the way that they've resolved whatever problems at home has always been just more empire, a bigger foreign policy, and so on. And we'll just send in the Marines. And so Butler was there. He was sent to Haiti. I think he was in Nicaragua for a while. They sent him,
Oh, yeah.
I think, on the Boxer expedition. I mean, it was all
Yep.
just imperialism.
He once said, I think something like this. He said, I beat Al Capone. Best he could do was control 2 states. I control 2 continents.
Yeah, yeah, and that's just the U.S. since that time period. But when you stop and think about it this way, and this is what I think more people are going to realize: it's capitalism and imperialism are pretty intertwined. The reason that the British go over and resume really just raping and pillaging Ireland is because of the birth of capitalism, the enclosure movement, and they need to resettle people. And so they even write about needing to resettle in the New World or send the excess population to the New World. So you get Jamestown and so on. And it's
Yep.
all imperialism and so on and they until they get from sea to shining sea, and then the Spanish American War, they keep going west, essentially across the ocean, and it's been fueled by commercial greed and imperialism since really the beginning. I'm not saying that's everything, but it is a huge part of the story, and you can't speak about any of the like progress and civil rights movement and whatever without acknowledging that this has always been a pretty brutal enterprise.
Yep. We used to proselytize for Christianities, ostensibly. Now we proselytize for the buck.
Right. That is the other part of this crisis I think that we're in as a culture, that when it comes, and C. Wright Mills said it before in the Power Elite. He said there's really no unifying myth. The closest we have is Horatio Alger, and that's bullshit. This is a country that just worships making a buck above all else. Like that's the one thing that never goes out of style in the US. Whatever changes we get, money is king. And that, because we grow up in it, we're just like fish that don't even know what water is. This is, but I think that probably you see this with your students. People are thinking more critically. How did we get to this point?
I think the people on the other side of the political aisle, if you will, that are facing Donald Trump recognize some of that phenomenon in him. I mean, that guy he brought predatory capitalism to a fruition I don't think even his bankers thought was possible. He's lived his whole life off debt,
Yeah, yeah.
whether it's cheating the IRS or it's cheating the contractors or cheating the hotel owners or whatever. He makes his money off debt. Oh, I bought that for 100 million, but I'm assessing it at 4 billion for tax purposes.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he's the American, the everyman in a sense, or the every shyster in a sense, because he bends the rules as much as possible, to the extent possible, and if he's not being punished for it, then he's playing the game the way that it is allowed to be played. And this is just what this is. It's so typical, and yet you know that's what we have. It's almost like he is the president that we deserve. Not that I want him to be president, but he
Yeah.
is the president that we deserve. And I guess this is a way to transition to maybe asking you about Russia and some of these terror attacks. As Trump is supposedly a Russian agent, that was the big hoax of you know the RussiaGate saga. And I was just talking about this recently, and about how absurd it was, because the whole hoax of RussiaGate, or the premise, is a quid pro quo between Russia and Trump, right? Except that there's no evidence that they made a deal of a quid pro quo. So that's one problem. And then there's really no quid, because Russia really didn't do anything substantive to help Trump, nor is there a quo because Trump didn't really do anything to make policy better with Russia. He made it more belligerent. And so the entire thing is a farce, and yet Russia is the boogeyman to the present day. And we had this recent terror attack in Moscow, which you have said is quite possibly something that the CIA had involvement with. I mean, what this Russian boogeyman business? What do you think of this in the context of this terror attack in Russia recently, which seems to be, if not by the U.S., I feel confident saying that it was networks that the U.S. and its allies have created, of paramilitaries and drug traffickers and everything else, jihadis, that did this. What do you think is the significance of this event? Because it's a pretty ghastly thing.
I don't think there's any question that there is a possibility. I'm not sure about the probability. I find the probability to be quite high, but the possibility is, what people discount entirely who are on the other side of the argument, if you will. And that's absurd. That's absurd. I point out to them what we did with the Iran Contra affair, and who we were dealing with, and how we dealt with them, how the CIA sold cocaine in Southern California in order to finance its operations against the Sandinistas, how they murdered a military individual in Honduras when he found out about it and tried to report it, how the CIA was working with ISIS in Syria, trying to use them to help them overthrow Bashar al Assad, and how even Marines and soldiers got in a firefight with the CIA because they didn't know they were in with ISIS, and they were. Um, we control some of these terrorist organizations to an extent that we can use them for nefarious purposes. We don't control them to the point where, and this is what I worry about all the time, where we can, stop them from doing something against our own interests. In fact, when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi put together the little kernel that grew into being the caliphate seeking ISIS, and we had to do something about it, that's when the CIA flowed into it big time, because it had all kind of peripheral members that it could use for all manner of purposes, to include, and who did this in Afghanistan? Thank you very much. Who did this in Afghanistan? Zig Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter. Who did this? They used the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets, or at least to give them some significant blows. It's routine. So I have no problem believing that we might have found some individuals that we thought could be pointed towards Moscow and pointed them in that direction. Maybe even facilitated their doing what they did. I don't think they would have had to do that. It would just be a matter of sharing a little intelligence. After all, we supposedly warned Moscow about a concert that they didn't attack. They apparently, even Russian sources say that they apparently came in to attack that concert and saw that due to the warnings, the Russians had beefed up security. So they just waited until they found one that didn't have beefed up security and attacked it. But it all sounds like, I have a really hard time thinking that William Burns had anything to do with that. But here's the other side of it. And go back to Iran-Contra again. What we did during Iran-Contra was unconscionable in terms of the statutory legislative decision-making process in our, quote, democracy, unquote. We went operational in the NSC. Admiral Poindexter was the National Security Advisor. Oliver North was one of the workers on the NSC, worker bees. We operationalized the NSC. They ran the Contras in Honduras. Ronald Reagan was almost impeached for doing that. I'm told right now from reputable sources that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has been running, giving rudder orders, we say in the military, the operation in the Red Sea, direct from the National Security Council office. Think about this for a moment. Victoria Nuland is in charge of clandestine operations with regard to Ukraine. As her parting shot, she does an Oliver North and sets this up for Moscow. I could see that happening. I don't have to go very far to see that happening.
Yeah, another theory that people have put forward is that perhaps she had planned something like this attack, because she had made these threats shortly before her departure, saying, Mr. Putin is in for some nasty surprises on the battlefield. I don't know if you've heard that. And then you have these attacks. So some people, which would have been around the time of the warning was around the time of the election. So some people have suggested that the warning was sent and that she was fired because other people higher up were alarmed at this. And then perhaps those same networks went ahead with it against the wishes of the U.S. or something else. But perhaps Nuland did have something to do with this, as you're saying.
You never, if you're a good clandestine operator, you never put motion to something that doesn't already have some of its own motion. So you find some people who are planning on, they'd already attacked in Iran, they had attacked in Syria. They're planning on taking on Moscow just as much as they're planning on, I am deadly sure of this, us eventually. And they make Al-Qaeda pale by comparison in terms of their now built up global capability to strike. So they've been bang, bang, banging all along. The momentum's there. You just walk into it and you say, how'd you like to do this? We'll give you a little intel. And, at the point where North and Poindexter were outed, so to speak, Reagan is about to be impeached. I mean, people tell me, and people whom I trust their views, congressmen and others who are, a couple of them now are deceased, but they were working on articles of impeachment because this was a really impeachable offense, unlike the stupid impeachments we've had since. So Reagan went and gave that speech, and he saved his presidency. He gave the speech and saved his presidency. He essentially said, "It happened, and I'm sorry, and it won't happen again." I mean, go back and look at the speech. He doesn't actually say, "I knew all about it," but the hint is there. I mean, that saved his presidency because it was like Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. He apologized to the American people, as well he should have. Got suckered in by the CIA and even more so by the military. They thought he would invade if the CIA operation failed, and they knew damn well the CIA operation was going to fail because they'd been down there in Nicaragua and they'd seen these people. They couldn't fight their way out of a wet storm. So the military was standing by to invade. And when they didn't invade, and here's the long story short, what did they do? What did Allen Dulles and certain members of the Pentagon do to JFK? Took him out. So it's not like we have a pristine presidency in any way, or a process that's pristine or clean and honest and decent and not full of moral turpitude about half the time. It's just as bad as anybody else in the world whom we hurl lightning bolts at for the stuff they do, including Moscow.
Right, and when you get to look at these networks of these terror networks, and as you were saying, we used ISIS in Syria. I know a guy who used to teach with the Jordanian at the Jordanian or the King's Academy, right? King's Academy in Jordan. He taught high school there in the history department, and the king would come there, and he told them at one point that this was around like 2010 or something like that, 2009, before the Arab Spring breaks out. He says, "Yeah, there's going to be this crazy group of like jihadis, and they're going to come out of nowhere, and they're going to set up their own principality, and it's just going to change the map, right?" And the guy that told me this is a pretty straight laced guy, and he's not even that political. He's more like a moderate. He's actually one of those history teachers who his students don't know if he's a Democrat or a Republican, right? So he's not a radical dude who's prone to making up these stories. He told me this, and I think that it's likely accurate because it did come out later that a lot of these people were involved. That there are Jordanian links to some of these ISIS figures. So I think that the whole thing was planned well in advance. And you have to look at the Arab Spring itself and what it did. Obama was out there talking about how the guy that self-immolated was like a heroic figure, but he was protesting a U.S. client regime. So why would Obama be out there? Why would Google and Facebook and the National Endowment for Democracy be working with these Egyptian people who were there to take down a U.S. puppet, supposedly? And what did the Arab Spring accomplish except for providing a pretext for two of those neocon wars that had been basically stalled out because of Bush's disastrous presidency? But then all of a sudden we're fighting Libya and Syria, those regimes, because of these protests that, and people over there in Egypt and Tahrir Square, like they named their kids like Facebook because they were so inspired by how Facebook helped them organize these protests. But what we know about Facebook and Google now, they're basically arms of the regime. I mean, how much of our history can we even say we know very much about in the 21st century?
I'd say since 1945, certainly since Eisenhower left the White House. And when I was at State, I looked at the NED and the IRI as arms of the CIA, not as democracy promoters. I looked at them as arms of the CIA, and the CIA looked at them that way too. And other NGOs too that they use, either wittingly or unwittingly, or sometimes a combination of the two in a single NGO they'll be using. Not like we hadn't done that before. I mean, Zapata Oil and other companies like that H.W. Bush was associated with, as you probably know, were CIA front companies. Not for nothing did they name Langley after a guy who'd been director only 9 months. He'd been with the CIA a lot longer than that. In his 8 years as vice president for Ronald Reagan, he ran them all. He ran all the clandestine operations. So very, very conversant with covert operations in particular. So the ISIS phenomenon, though, is curious because when it first broke out, we were seeing things like fire direction centers, tanks, mainline artillery being operated with some finesse. And we said, we being military professionals, we said that can't be because these people don't know how to do this. Going to a sophisticated fire direction center and direct artillery. Come on. So we did a little backgrounding and looking around. And it was a Republican Guard. It was the Sunnis that we had made so angry with David Petraeus's intensification of the surge and all that kind of stuff. We had made them so angry, and the Iraqis had helped us. The Shias had begun murdering them and putting them in dungeons and torturing them. So they said, okay, enough of that. They ran out and took over Zarqawi's outfit and turned it into ISIS and gave it really heavy armament, and all came from the Republican Guard. No one ever said that, but the CIA damn sure knew it. And we created a thing we had to go back into Iraq to do something about. I'm not sure that they couldn't have handled it on their own, but it would have taken some time.
But
And they
that's
were
just
killing
it, though.
people.
That's just it. Is they emerge at the perfect time to give the U.S. a pretext to stick around Iraq more when they
Yep,
were otherwise going to have to leave.
yep.
The whole. My understanding is that if you are in the Middle East and you talk to anyone, that pretty much anyone you meet will say that they believe ISIS is CIA. Like Hamid Karzai said this. Even I mean,
They
I
were
think it was
close.
Patrick Coburn. Patrick Coburn said in the Independent article or in a Harper's article, I can't remember which. It was one of the Coburn guys, not not Alex, who was already dead by then, I think. But he wrote
Andrew,
that
maybe?
it could have been Andrew, and he
Yeah.
said that in Iraq, everyone that you talk to says ISIS is CIA.
I I certainly could understand Karzai saying that because Karzai was one of the few people on the other side, as it were, that knew that the military was not running Afghanistan, the U.S. military, nor NATO, nor the international force. What was running Afghanistan was the CIA. All you had to do was watch that one trial where they finally, Petraeus, bless Petraeus, finally got together with other forces in Afghanistan and brought the principal drug lord in Afghanistan to trial, only to be stopped at the courtroom door by the CIA station chief and told, go away, you can't do this. That's who ran Afghanistan, the CIA, from the moment it started to the moment it ended. And the military knew that and knew they couldn't get around ISIS, get around ISI and CIA. They were locked. And the CIA, of course, a typical American organization, thought it was running the ISI, and the ISI was just laughing at them behind closed doors. I mean, and Steve Cole writes about a lot of this. Steve didn't get the really serious blame that should accrue to the United States. He got a lot of it. But I mean, Karzai got it. Karzai knew who was running the U.S. effort, international effort in Afghanistan, and it wasn't the military nor the State Department.
Right. I mean, after 9/11, they sprang drug dealers from jail. People that had been, or
Absolutely.
not, they one of them was sprung from jail, but then another guy who had retired to like France because he made a lot of money during the Mujahideen era. They basically persuaded him to come back and reestablish these drug connections in Afghanistan. And before the war in Afghanistan, you had all of these intrigues that began under Bush, but they may have been more Israeli and British because you had this coup in Azerbaijan that involved jihadis and people
Yep.
like they set up this airline that was kind of like Air America with Richard Secord and Ed Dearborn from the Iran Contra time and Air
Yep.
America veterans themselves. And they begin flying it. They ship. It's the same thing: weapons and heroin, and then jihadi networks like the Chechen jihadis, right? And the U.S. was fueling that war in Chechnya, and they end up having a rat line of heroin and so on that goes from Azerbaijan, Chechnya to Kosovo, and that ends up being a part of the Kosovo war is like a drug trafficking thing, but also there's oil pipelines planned there too, because these things are intertwined. And there's one episode that is really overlooked, and it's the Moscow apartment bombings of 2000. And those were apparently planned at a villa. This was written about it by a few places. One guy at the Hoover Institute, and then one of the Coburns wrote an article on it as well. it appears that the Moscow apartment bombings were planned by people, this very bizarre assortment of characters at Adnan Khashoggi's villa, although I don't think he was there. And the people were like Chechen warlords, some Russian people in the Russian government high up, and that they apparently planned this. And this was the beginning of the second Chechen war. People have tried to blame this on Putin, but he really was just either barely, he was barely in power at all. And if you look at who these people are, they trace back not to people that are loyal to Putin who planned this, but to people like Berezovsky, the oligarch that ended up going
Yeah.
to fleeing, a guy who was totally a Western stooge. So a lot of these networks that were doing this, these jihadi networks, the Al Qaeda International that goes into Chechnya, but they seem to have been cooperating with these Western intelligence entities that might be U.S. or might be Israel and British intelligence working together with Saudis as well. It's hard to know exactly who is steering this, but when you look at
Well,
that episode, it seems like it overlaps a lot with the 9/11 networks, and they all
it,
seem to be gearing towards the same sort of objectives of American domination of the energy heartlands of the world.
and it's not hard to see where America got really started in it. I'm sure it probably preceded this, but where they really got fully into it was with Carter and the support of the Mujahideen against Russia in Afghanistan. And I have no doubt in my mind that there's even a distinct possibility that the CIA, at least the team that was, I can't talk about it in anything but general terms, but the team that was assigned more or less to protect the line of Panjshir, Massoud, wasn't actually in on Massoud's execution because they knew that Massoud would be a reasonably moral man for Afghanistan and wouldn't go along with a lot of the things that they had planned for Afghanistan and the ISI had planned for Afghanistan. And so they got rid of him.
Yeah,
Blamed it on Al
I
Qaeda.
co-wrote an article on this with Peter Dale Scott, and then Pepe Escobar later cited it. And the gist of it is, this is amazing to me that this happened, but it seems that the order to kill him, to draft this letter that allowed them to get the introduction to blow him up, the guys that did this, it came from the blind sheikh in U.S. custody under blanket surveillance. And then it went to another guy in Britain, who's another person who should be in jail for his jihadi activities and isn't. And that this was really where it came from. And so he gets killed a couple days before 9/11. And Pepe and the other people had talked to him, and he was dead set. Massoud was dead set against U.S. boots on the ground.
Yeah.
He was, and he dies right beforehand. And on the day before he's assassinated, there are a couple days before, there are meetings in the White House, and you would have been in the White House at this time. I mean, working for them, and they were discussing a political military plan for Afghanistan. And then on the day after, September 10th, they have another meeting talking about the political military plan for Afghanistan, including, U.S. military intervention. And then 9/11 happens the next day. So I suspect that these neocon, global dominance, neocon international forces, or the CIA, whoever is really in charge of these things, that they got rid of Massoud because they needed him out of the way. The symmetry of the whole thing is just perfect, and it's a huge scandal. And it's Peter and I wrote an article in it about it with Covert Action, but it's like, it's one of these things that just sits there because it's so controversial that other media won't really take it up.
No, the regular media, the mainstream media, is more than ever, even worse than the Randolph Hearst days, a tool of the government. You read the New York Times today, for example, which I only do to check on this. I don't even take the rag anymore. But you read it and you say, is there anyone at the New York Times who doesn't write glowingly about Israel? Is there anyone who writes in any, sort of sympathetic terms, if not empathetic terms, about the Palestinians? it's just, you read an article, it's just line after line, paragraph after paragraph. And of course, we know what they did with regard to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Just took Cheney's word and printed it above the fold, front page, right side, every morning.
Right. And
The,
yeah.
the one that Chris Edges wrote the other day, he wrote a long, not long for Chris, but he wrote an editorial about the shame of the New York Times. It was spot on, spot on.
Right. And the way that these conflicts are handled sometimes, we talked about Wolfowitz and, leaking the Wolfowitz doctrine to the press to sort of sound the alarm in a way. But on the other side, the H.W. Bush time period, you were there, and I see this as being when the conflict kind of worked out. It began to work more in favor of the neocons because they defeat H.W. Bush. And I think that some of Clinton's difficulties trace back to this. I think the Lewinsky thing seems like a Mossad kind of operation. Now that we know Epstein, works this, handled a lot of these things, it all looks this way. But even as I look back on H.W. Bush, there are a lot of strange things going on in his presidency, like the BCCI unravels, for example, and he was
Yeah.
associated with that. And what forces could have led to that being those revelations at that time being leaked? I think it damaged him. The Iraqgate stuff started to come out. You had that strange promise Inslaw case and leaks related to that reporter Cosolaro, who eventually dies. And it's hard to make sense of all these things. You have the John Tower and Hines die on consecutive days in plane crashes. Senators do. And these were both senators who were not on the neocon side of it, as far as I know. In fact, Tower was supposed to be defense secretary,
Yep.
and then
Yep.
and then all of a sudden Cheney becomes there because is in the post because Tower doesn't have the moral rectitude of like a Dick Cheney. He drinks too much and he likes women. And Tower is just like, I'm a senator. What do you expect? But then you get Dick Cheney in there.
Cheney had been working on that since he was a 34-year-old chief of staff in the White House. I actually had
Yeah.
I had an 80-year-old man who was still lucid as hell asked me to lunch the first week I was at the State Department. And we sat down to the lunch, and I said, he'd been in the White House off and on for about 38 years, mostly administrative positions, but very close to chiefs of staff and things like that. He said, I wanted to sit down with you and tell you some things. First of all, Donald Rumsfeld lies like you wouldn't believe it. He lied all around Jerry Ford, got Jim Schlesinger fired, got the job, and brought Cheney in. And then he started talking about Cheney. And I'd had congressmen already talk to me about Cheney when he was Secretary of Defense. They'd said things like, Dick never met a defense program he didn't like. He doesn't study it. He doesn't go after it for detail. He just votes for it. And Dick is determined. He's absolutely, you've heard the old adage about the Wyoming cowboy. Well, Dick is a Wyoming cowboy. He's determined. He's going to go wherever he needs to go. And he's going to do whatever he needs to do to get there. So I had no problem watching it happen as he selected himself to be Vice President of the United States. Right after he left the Pentagon, when he'd been Secretary of Defense, Powell came back down, went to the regular meeting right after Clinton had been selected president-elect. He went to the regular meeting upstairs and he came back and he told Nancy Hughes, his executive secretary, and I happened to be standing there. He said, the Secretary of Defense has left. Cheney's gone. Didn't say boo to me. He's just gone. That was Cheney. Cold as a fish. Gone. Already gone. Well, one reason he was gone was because he wanted to get with Jim Baker, whom he had talked into escorting him around the United States to see if there was any possibility he could build up the donor base and other things to become president. Came back only about a month and a half later and essentially says, Baker left him and told him, no chance in hell. You just don't have it. You don't have the name recognition. You don't have the charisma. You don't have the political skills to get elected. That's when Dick said, if I can't get elected president, I'll get vice president for someone whom I can be president for. And he engineered the whole thing. In my view, he engineered the whole thing, the selection committee, his own selection. Shrewd man in terms of political operator.
Right. And I think that he and Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld traces back to, as a congressman, if I'm remembering this correctly, he was one of he contacted Robert Kennedy, or maybe because he was the Attorney General, over this issue of registering the American Zionist Council, the main Zionist lobbying organization at the time. They wanted him to register as a foreign agent, and Rumsfeld, all the way back during the early '60s, his earliest times in Congress, he was already there, like flacking for the Israel lobby.
Yep, already on the payroll. And you don't want to miss this book that's coming out. I think it's finished completely now. The Pentagon Review, CIA Review. Pentagon redacted a whole bunch, so they went back and said, "Nope, we're going to sue you. You can't redact this. This is all embarrassing to you. That's the reason you're redacting it." So it's coming out now. It'll have some redaction, but not a lot. It's called Deadly Betrayal, and it's by a guy who was in Fife's office for the time that Fife was occupying it. And one of the things he points out is that
the
every day,
Office of Special
yeah,
Plans, the
yeah,
special propaganda arm to create Iraq War intelligence.
Undersecretary of Defense for Policy officially, every day that this guy was there, Mossad was there. They didn't have to go through any security. They didn't have to do any checks or anything. I couldn't have done it. They just walked into the building, went to work. And they had their counterpart in Baghdad once we'd invaded Iraq. And this book is supposed to be a barn burner in terms of Deadly Betrayal is a good title for it. I can't wait to read it. I read the manuscript before it went in, but now it's been worked on for about a year since then. So, and I pointed him at a number of people he should talk to with regard to oil for Israel and some other things. This goes back to Mark Rich. It's Netanyahu. Mark Rich bought oil from Saddam Hussein, violating the UN sanctions. Mark Rich then gave the oil almost to Israel. He sold it at much discounted prices for an extended period of time, which, as finance minister, built up Netanyahu's portfolio as a genius, an economic genius. That gets him into the prime minister's office, and it keeps going, and the discounted oil keeps flowing in. Well, they caught him. They caught Mark Rich, of course, and put him in jail. What was Clinton's last ignominious act in the Oval Office? He pardoned Mark Rich and let him out of jail. But that's building Netanyahu's power base and building his influence with the Israeli people, not because they loved him as an individual, but because he brought them no terrorists in the discos and lots of money. Lots of money. I mean, their high tech just expanded like hell. They were getting all this cheap energy. That was the base of it. And once you get to the point where we're in Syria and we're in Iraq, you find all these kind of strange things happening from the Deputy Secretary of Defense. First, he gives orders to Tommy Frank that Rumsfeld knows nothing about to bomb this one particular place in Syria as a message to this particular government in Syria that they got to keep that discounted oil that was coming out of Syria at this point and going in an undisclosed pipeline. It's disclosed now to Haifa. I mean, it's a long story of nefarious activities by a host of characters who were making tons of money, violating sanctions, making tons of money, but all of them, nefarious or upright, were working for Israel.
Yeah, and I just came across something, and no one has reported on it yet. It happened with the last round of JFK declassification in 2022. I think it's in December. And it is James Angleton's testimony, only now it's much less redacted. And what was revealed was a discussion over the fact that he had the Israeli account and this Israeli liaison relationship. And it's quite remarkable because he is talking about this and the person also who is questioning him, the main person is John Tower at the time, which is fascinating. But what they get into is that this was kept out before. The Israeli account is what they call it, and it's mostly redacted, but then they leave it in a couple times, so you are pretty clear what they're talking about. And the Israeli account is not totally explained, except that part of it is that they work with Mossad and that they have these different assets and that they were involved with the Cuban business and that Bill Harvey was eventually connected to the Israeli side of things with the Cuban business, down there, because they had assets in Cuba that they could use, and so they were a part of planning things like the operations after the Bay of Pigs and so on, and probably the Bay of Pigs too. This asset, because this this liaison relationship was reconstituted in the 50s when Angleton was there. I think it was in 51. And of course, Harry Truman owed his reelection, as I understand it, in part to a big contribution that he got from pro-Israel people after he recognized Israel in 1948. That's come out in the past, and so that may be why they were more friendly to them. But I suspect that when they're writing about Angleton and Harvey and the Cuban business, as they call it, that this gets into Meyer Lansky and the assassination, the mob connection between those CIA plots to kill Castro, and how those were eventually used to kill, some version of it was used against Kennedy, but that Israel was involved with all of that. And that seems to have given them some blackmail or something, because it comes up in weird ways, the Israel thing and the JFK case. I mean, the guy that actually bankrolled the executive producer of Oliver Stone's JFK was Arnon Milchan, who's known to be an Israeli intelligence agent. I mean, the relationship between Israel and Israel being intertwined with some of our most sensitive information, and the fact that they were so close to Angleton, who did help to give them their nuclear bomb material. I feel that they have an enormous amount of blackmail on the U.S., and it's hard to know where to attribute these policies, what the driving force here is. But now, as we see this in Gaza and how determined they are to carry out this greater Israel plan, I mean, I think that these people are nuts, and that the logic that guides them is not the same as the U.S. of just like, hey, let's make a world that's going to be forever safe to make a buck in, and no one will mess with this. Like, I think that the Zionists, because they're more vulnerable out there in that little piece of land that they think is so important, they are just more fanatical, and they have played a nefarious role here that we cannot fully discern, but should be terrifying now, because it seems that it has the potential to bring us to nuclear doomsday.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if you've read Martin Schoetz's book on History Will Not Absolve Us, on the assassination. There's no question in my mind that it was a CIA military conspiracy. The mafia was probably in there too. And the most important thing Schultz does, he's a child psychiatrist. The most important thing he does, for me anyway, in reading the book, is not only prove through quotation after quotation of Arlen Specter asking questions before the Warren Commission, just mundane stuff like that, where you got to say to yourself, well, wait a minute, that's not what he told you. That's not what he told you. That's not what the autopsy revealed. That's not what the ballistics reveal. And yet you see it all being shaped. But what he tells you about the psychology of it is really intriguing, and it explains Trump. It explains what's happening today in a more I don't want to use the word evil, but a more malevolent way than I think anyone else has attempted to do. We went to Noam Chomsky and the Nation editorial staff all blessed the Warren Commission. The John Birch Society blessed the Warren Commission. I mean, you got this span of political beliefs and methodologies and such, and they're all saying it's good, it's good. And he just says, well, we had to kill him because he threatened everything. Read the speech at American University in the summer of '63. He threatened everything. He said, rapprochement with Russia, rapprochement with Cuba, world disarmament, and world peace. Those are anathema to the group. They're anathema. No matter whether they're Democrat, Republican, or Independent. You can't say world peace. You destroy our whole reason for living. And so they killed him. And that's why everybody bought it, from Chomsky to the John Birch Society. But the interesting thing he points out, too, is that 60 to 70%, and it grows every year, of the American people, when polled, don't buy it. They buy conspiracy. They just don't know exactly how to phrase it, put it together, and say who exactly was responsible for it. But it's the psychiatric evaluation of us as a people that he does in this book that intrigues me, because it explains Trump and his cult. You can really take the American people into some deep, evil, dark places if you know how to manipulate them. And we have people all over who know how to manipulate them. AI will give that an even greater oomph, if you will. So 1945 forward, I'm sure that Zachary Taylor and Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, and a host of other who murdered the Indians mercilessly, and a host of other people did some evil things in our history. No question about it. But today, we have a cottage industry in evil. And it's so hypocritical for John Kirby to stand up there and say the things he says, and the State Department spokesman to stand up there and say the things. It's just, it's mind-boggling that these people, they must be really, really obtuse, or they're on the payroll. And in most cases, it's probably a little bit of both. Mostly it's just, as I was during the WMD presentation at the UN, hey, I did my job, and my boss is telling me I did it pretty well. Maybe I ought to go walk in the streets of New York here, clear my head, and ask myself what I really did. Maybe that wasn't so much a success as I thought. But the polls are pouring in saying the American people now, in great majority, support an invasion of Iraq. So we did our job.
Right, and that's going to be a tough thing to weigh on you and other people that were involved with it. And yet, the frightening thing is for the people that don't worry about it, like the Dick Cheneys of the world. This
Yep.
is the scarier thing. So these organizations, they create people, they force people to do these things, or they compel them. And if you had quit, then you could have quit, and then I don't know that it would have made any difference anyway. This is
No. And people tell me Powell should have resigned, and I say Condi would have become Secretary of State within 10 days in a confirmation hearing, and we'd gone right on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't
Been
think
a
that it would
bigger,
have stopped.
there'd been a bigger hiccup maybe, but that's all it would have been, was a hiccup.
Right. Yeah, this whole imperial project, I think, has to unwind. It has to become no longer tenable for the US to act this way. Somehow the incentive structures of the world system need to change so that they're no longer compelled to act in this criminal way, that that it essentially is in their better interest to be good citizens of the world and to start working with the rest of the world to solve the world's problems, which are actually more solvable, I think, than we believe. I'm kind of like an optimist, like Sachs. Jeff Sachs nowadays, what he says now is pretty much like he's summarizing my dissertation, which I figured was too radical for me to even try to get a post in the university. And Sachs sounds like he says most of the things that I say now, which is really amazing to me. So I think, can common sense prevail somehow and reason prevail? Maybe this will be the last question for you here, because we're about out of time. But do you think that the fact that the U.S. cannot really be able to do what it's done for so long, that this is eventually going to affect a regime change of sorts, because we can't actually do what we've done? Like, it's actually going to be impossible unless we blow up the world.
I think you're onto something, but I think it's going to be very traumatic, and I think it's going to take a truly cataclysmic change in the way we rule ourselves, if that's the right phrase to use. I think of it this, I was thinking of this, I was reading Peter Frankopan's marvelous book, The Silk Roads, A New World History. And all through the middle section of it, I'm thinking to myself, Constantine in the Istanbul-based Roman Empire, Constantinople then, had a choice. He could fight Christianity and probably destroy the empire, or he could meld Christianity into his empire and go on for another 100, 200 years, using Christianity as his propellant force. He decided on the latter. You're talking about some kind of monumental change like that would have to present itself. And I'm not saying Constantine made a good decision, but someone would have to be there that had the power to make a decision like that and to execute it, even more importantly. I don't see that. I see us dismembering ourselves at worst, and at best going on for a few more decades, and then the rest of the world moves decisively to balance us. and all we can do is hide behind our oceans.
Which it would be okay. I think between the U.S. and Canada's resources, we could have a society that was sustainable here. We don't
That's
have
the
to do what we've done.
that's the really fascinating aspect of it to me, is that why are we doing this other than to make a few people very, very insanely, obscenely rich?
The richest, most powerful individuals in human history. That's what
Yep,
this empire supports right now, and that is
yep,
why there's a people with a very big interest in keeping it going.
yep.
Well, Lawrence Wilkerson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me. Good luck to you.
Okay, as promised, I am now going to discuss something that I think is really fascinating and very relevant to the conversations that I've been having on the podcast, on American Exception, on Devil's Chess Club, and elsewhere. And I have to thank patron and friend of the podcast, Scott Alfieri, for sending me a link to this, because otherwise I don't know that I would have found it. The link was to a LinkedIn post by someone named Jeff Cruikshank, and he wrote a fairly useful summary of this new document. And it's not a document that has never been seen before. It's just it was heavily redacted up until now, and I don't believe that people have really commented on this or noticed it because these document dumps are so big, or for whatever reason. But I think that there are some remarkable things in here that are all things people have talked about before in one aspect or another. And strangely, I've sort of hypothesized some of these things without knowing that there was as much actual basis for them as there seems to be based on these documents. So I find this really fascinating and kind of confirmation of some of the things I've been discussing of late. The document in question is the testimony to the church committee of James Jesus Angleton. And the person that he is talking to, or one of the main people leading this discussion, that deposition or whatever you want to call it, testimony, is John Tower, the senator that we were talking about earlier. So that to me is pretty fascinating to consider why he was, in this position. And then, of course, he dies in a plane crash the day before or the day after. Another Republican senator died as well, John Hines. So very strange case. And he's also a guy who Cheney replaced in order to become Secretary of Defense after John Tower was basically forced out by this sort of media witch hunt, calling him a womanizer and a guy who drank too much, which I would guess that both of those things are true. But as I said before, I'd heard, or whether the urban legend or the hearsay or whatever, was that John Tower after this was really puzzled and thought like, well, of course I am a womanizer and enjoy drinking. I'm an American senator. What do you expect, right? So but that's not really that important. What is more important is the testimony, and so I want to get right into it. This is a little bit more complicated, maybe related to classified documents more so than some of the things that I do typically on this podcast. So if you find this stuff kind of complicated or confusing, this might not be your cup of tea. But for some of you who are interested in the JFK case, I hope that you would find this interesting. And if you've been following my work of late, as I've tried to talk about the neocon takeover of U.S. foreign policy and the move towards this sort of unipolar uber alles mentality of the U.S. empire, then you may find this fascinating. I hope you find it as interesting as I do. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some of the main areas that I found more interesting. There are other things that have been newly unredacted that are kind of more complicated, but and the whole thing is worth reading, and we'll try to put a link to it in the show notes. But I'll start with this discussion over James Angleton having 2 jobs at the CIA. So he's asked, can you briefly state this connection between your counterintelligence work and blank, redacted? Or even more generally, how did you happen to have both of these jobs, but you don't know what the second job is? Of course, he's known as the counterintelligence chief because that's what he's famous for. He's a notorious, famous or infamous, one of the two, as the head of counterintelligence. Now, on this redaction, as far as this redaction goes, it's not the most useful because they essentially tell us in a bit. Okay, so he says here, he continues, you developed a kind of relationship, perhaps a friendly relationship, with persons connected with the new state of Israel or the hoped for state of Israel back in the 1940s. So this is, you already are getting a hint that this is something related to Israel. Now, finally, the redaction, we're able to see what it is, but I'll get to that. Angleton offers this. One of my men married, I might say, the head of the Zionist movement in Italy, the underground. So I had a connection to this man. He was very important. That would be really interesting to know more details about that. In 1954, I had a special operational unit and was made head of the counterintelligence. And then he's asked, in the period beginning in 54 and until 74, when you left the agency, did you have any relationship? Is the Israeli account the wrong way to say it? Okay, so this seems to be, now we know what the redacted part is, the Israeli account. It would seem that that's what it's in reference to, and it kind of makes sense in the context of everything else in the document, as you'll see. So if anyone has any different interpretation on this or wants to correct anything that I said, because sometimes these statements don't make perfect sense. There's questions about any sort of transcription like this. There's grammatical errors, there's some spelling errors. Then there's, and of course, you're dealing with James Jesus Angleton, who is a notorious liar and professional liar. I mean, he considers lying like, part of his tradecraft. It's really a great occupation he's in. So reconstituting the Israeli account. Angleton says, yeah, sure, call it the Israeli account. That's as good as any other name. So he says, did you have any relationship with the Israeli account? This part is confusing to me. He must mean in regards to the new unit, perhaps in 1951. I'm not really sure exactly, because he says, no, that began in 1951. There was no relationship between the agency and the Israeli account. Or maybe this is something else. If somebody could explain what this may mean, if it's not the Israeli account, it would be interesting to know what this is about. Perhaps it's related to some sort of more serious Office of Security thing. I'm not certain on this. So he says there wasn't any from 47, 46 on. It began in 51. It was reconstituted in 51, and I was the negotiator of the arrangement. So I think what he's saying here is that when he was with the OSS, there was this relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and so it hadn't been that would have dissolved when the OSS was dissolved formally, but of course there's going to be links between people like Angleton and people connected to Israeli intelligence. But he says it was reconstituted in 1951, and I was the negotiator of the arrangement. So it must be what he is referring to here. How was that arrangement negotiated? It was negotiated by finding what we have in common. It was reviewed by Hillenkoetter, who was like the first CIA director, I believe, and then he was succeeded by General Walter Beadle Smith. These two guys were not Wall Street lawyers like other CIA people would be. Harry Truman intentionally wanted to have military people running this because he had a little bit of mistrust of like the dullest crowd and some of these Wall Street people, even though he was kind of their man, whether he knew it or not. There were traces of some New Deal political beliefs in Truman that would occasionally surface, but mostly he was the handmaiden and the midwife, really, of the post-war U.S. empire. We would go ahead and reestablish a relationship, and after a lot of bureaucratic problems, they gave me the account. So there was some sort of debate and discussion throughout the bureaucracy, but eventually they decide to make Angleton the manager of the Israeli account. So he describes it as a sensitive, compartmentalized arrangement, and this part I think is noteworthy. The Israelis were, this must be they were informed that we would not work with them against the Arabs, that we would work with them on Soviet intelligence and Soviet bloc intelligence and communism where it existed. Paper and operations discussion. Okay, so he says, was this agreement in the form of a paper? And Angleton answers, paper and operations discussion. Under whose authority was the agreement made? Under the authority of the Director of Central Intelligence and the blank on the other side, which we would have to assume is supposed to say Mossad. I don't think there was any clearance obtained from the Hill, and whoever was, dealing with this redaction or looking at it later, somebody underlined it. So that's, that's interesting. Was it regarded as an obligation or a commitment from the U.S. to Israel on certain matters? When you use the word U.S., he says, while you may use it as contracting officers and all that, there was very little reduced to writing. And this part is underlined. And it is a custom of intelligence that intelligence supersedes writing. Well, this is disturbing because this is just more affirmation of things I've written about in American Exception, and other people have written that about these intelligence matters. I drew from Ola Tanander and some of these with some of these issues, because he said that's how it was in NATO. That basically the rule for some of these countries in NATO, like Sweden, which was supposed to not be in NATO until recently, now they are, but they basically always have been. And what Ola Tanander told me, based on discussions he had with high-ranking Swedish military officials and such, is that the rule for Sweden was nothing in writing. So they basically had an agreement with the U.S. that they had to do whatever they say on security matters, but there was to be no writing. It wasn't to be in writing, and they were not formally part of NATO. So when they say this is very alarming, because it means that these guys basically will make agreements and make plans with each other, and some of them aren't even put into writing. And you have to believe that the more sensitive and dark something is, the less likely you're going to want to leave a paper trail. So he says, there have been very few directors to my knowledge that would put their pen to hand and sign an agreement to some understanding. It's based on a fiduciary relationship and common understanding. So he's saying that basically these kind of liaison arrangements are not something that people really want to sign and spell out perfectly. They're based on a sort of common understanding and verbal agreements and so on. Fiduciary relationship means somehow money-wise that it won't be very unfair in terms of money one way or the other. I guess that part seems a little strange to me. But this is noteworthy that he's saying this. Very few directors would put their pen to hand and sign something like this. Who knew about this? He's asked about this specifically. How was it possible for succeeding directors to understand what the agreements were between, in this case, and the blank and the U.S. and intelligence service, presumably Mossad? So he's saying, how could other directors of the CIA, after the initial ones, really understand all of these secret agreements between intelligence services like this? Now, if you recall, in I believe it was last week's episode of Devil's Chess Club, John Kiriakou was saying that the holy grail of intelligence people is, and the most sensitive, secretive things are signals intelligence, stuff that the NSA gathers, probably a lot of it they're not supposed to gather, I would assume. And then arrangements between intelligence agencies, foreign intelligence agencies, which this is something I argue in American Exception also, that the U.S. has used intelligence agencies as sock puppets to do some of their dirtiest work. And this to me is just great confirmation of this, and the conversation with John as well. So this is pretty remarkable. How are succeeding directors supposed to know about these secret verbal agreements? And if they're not put to paper, this really gives a framework for a kind of continuity of covert actionability and other policies that could be carried out by the spooks and in the U.S. and in client states with really very little supervision from the White House or anyone else, but even the CIA director. Now, this is an interesting one. Following through on the subject of probably the Israeli account, up to your departure in 1974, is there any connection between your departure and handling of the Israeli desk? And if there is, what is the question? So he's being asked, because James Angleton was essentially forced out through selective leaking and strategic leaking, probably by William Colby. That comes up later. And then people, underneath Colby that may have been talking to people in the press. So they're asking, was this something that upset people like Colby and others? And so they therefore, because they were unhappy about the Israeli funny business in some way or another. Was this why he was forced out? Because he was forced out in a strange way. When Angleton leaves, he starts talking to people like Joe Trento, and he supposedly showed Joe Trento this document that said, someday we're going to have to explain what E. Howard Hunt was doing in Dallas on November 22nd. And people have wondered what that meant. I believe in talking to Peter Dale Scott about this, I think he was the one who said this. He suggested that in the mid 70s, it was looking like they might do some kind of limited hangout for uh, the Kennedy assassination, for the JFK assassination, and Angleton was worried that he would be the person to take the blame for it. And so he started leaking some things like this, which is, to my mind, quite remarkable that he would be doing this. And then some of his other people were like in the press. Joe Trento was a guy who took him seriously and wrote about him. And Angleton's thing was to talk about the JFK assassination and try to always imply that it was a Soviet thing. It was really that it was the Soviets were behind it. It was really absurd. Another guy that Angleton used in the press, as I recall, was Epstein. The guy, not Jeffrey Epstein, but I think it's Edward J. Epstein might be his name. The guy that wrote one of the early critiques of the Warren Commission, but then later he sort of had this weird kind of relationship slash like stalking, something very strange with George de Mohrenschildt, and he was the last guy to talk to him. So you have to wonder if Angleton was trying to somehow guide people to into somehow he was maybe trying to turn up the heat on the Kennedy assassination. I can't quite figure out what is the significance of Epstein being an Angleton, asset more or less. And then interviewing and kind of harassing and frightening de Mohrenschildt, talking to him about how he was going to have to go get more electroshock psychiatric treatment and so on. And this is before de Mohrenschildt either is killed, which is I think more likely, or committed suicide. So it's a very strange episode. Okay, so is there any connection between his firing and the Israeli desk? He said, Colby, who is not my cup of tea professionally or in any other way, and in my view is on the negative side of life. He hates William Colby. And Dr. Schlesinger, presumably James Schlesinger, the person who replaced Richard Helms as head of the CIA, and the guy who wanted the family jewels files rounded up so that they could have basically dirt on the CIA, which is just a fascinating thing. Nixon felt that the CIA was somehow screwing him with Watergate, and so he fires Helms, and he wants Schlesinger to dig up as much dirt as he can, and Colby is the person that gets tasked for that. Let's say, okay, so Schlesinger, before he went to defense, said that Colby was the only other person on Watergate. So you've got certain persons who are very prominent, and that was the negative aspect of self-inspection and inferiors reporting on superiors until they came through the snake pit. So I think that he's trying to say, when he says Colby was the only other person on Watergate, it could be that Schlesinger and Colby were the people in the CIA who were kind of brought in to deal with Watergate and Watergate related issues as they pertain to the CIA. That's how I take that. And when he says inferiors reporting on superiors, this is, essentially the family jewels process, getting all of the instances of when the CIA overstepped its charter, which says it's not supposed to operate in the United States. And of course, the CIA broke its own charter and broke the laws all the time, American laws, just like it breaks laws around the world anytime that it sees fit, essentially. So this question of opening the windows, which I'll try to explain. In contrast to Schlesinger, he began to regard the Israeli account as something where we had to open the windows and let the air in. And he used phrases such as, we must help out Henry, and a few other things. Okay, so when they move Schlesinger over to defense, Colby, according to Angleton, has a different point of view about the Israeli account. Schlesinger supposedly just wanted to preserve, or presumably wanted to preserve, this relationship, whereas Colby wanted to, quote, let the air in, meaning let people understand what has been going on here. Now, this part, we must help out Henry and a few other things, that's very interesting. And you wonder what he means. I assume they're talking about Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Director, and before the Halloween massacre was also the National Security Advisor. Was he talking about something where Henry Kissinger was at odds with the Israelis? Because the Israelis Nixon had a more contentious relationship with Israel than some U.S. presidents, but Israel also helped the U.S. during this time, I would argue, by entering a war which really didn't have much purpose. Two U.S. allied blocks here on the Arab side, because by then there was a U.S. puppet in there, Sadat, who seems to have been given help from the CIA to make sure that he would be the one to come to power after Nasser dies. And some people think Nasser was poisoned. I would probably guess that he was. There's been one journalist even wrote something about him being poisoned and suggested, as I recall, that Sadat may have been the person who did it, but who knows? Either way, in 1973 they fight that Yom Kippur War, and that is kind of that's part of a big part of the pretext for raising oil prices enormously, which essentially saves the dollar because it helps to deal with all of the excess dollars that are supposed to be redeemed for gold, but that are really threatening the dollar and the stability of the dollar in the long term. One must remember there are still 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. The relationship is the only place where you do it with the high-level agencies who work for ideology and do not work for money. So there's, in this case, he is saying that the Israeli commitment to having these Jewish people leave the Soviet Union and their commitment to the state of Israel as this project is such that they would help the U.S. With counterintelligence and with intelligence related to the Soviet Union coming from defectors, which is supposedly very valuable. And they would do it because they're ideologically committed to it. It's not just a matter of paying them off to do it. My second point was that everything should be run on the grounds of need to know and should not go into the Arab division until there was peace in the area. What this may explain some of the things that we've heard about or read about in the past, that the CIA had a number of Arabists who were not pro-Israel, who believed that it made more sense for the U.S. to ally with Arab countries because this was a majority Arab part of the world, and that if the U.S. sided with Israel as it was doing bad things to the Arabs that were living there before it was determined that there was going to be this thing called Israel, this would be something that would be bad for the U.S. if they back them too much. So the way that they dealt with this very special secret relationship between the two intelligence agencies of Israel and the United States was to keep things compartmentalized and not to let the Arab division have any idea what was going on. They say until there was peace in the area. So once you've had peace in Israel Palestine, then I guess we could tell the Arab people what we've been up to, the Arabists in the CIA. So this is pretty ridiculous, as we'd expect. Our job was to preserve the integrity of the immigration from the Soviet bloc, because the problem of escape to Israel is a religious problem. It's not a political problem. The fruits of that immigration came to this government. I take that to mean that the immigrants to Israel, the people who left the Soviet Union to come to Israel, Jewish people, that they would have had very useful information about the Soviet Union, and so that came to benefit the U.S. So the counterintelligence aspect of this is very useful, and they were able to get good intelligence from the Israelis, the people that had left the Soviet Union. Therefore, the idea of opening the doors on things and so on, to me, seemed absolutely contrary to the spirit and what had been going on for 22 years. So Angleton, totally unhappy. 22 years, if it was started in 51, then that would have meant 73? And that was a notable year. That was the year of that Yom Kippur War and the big oil shock. So that's interesting that he says 22 years, if that's really what he meant for 1973, when presumably some of these deliberations were taking place. The idea of opening the doors, letting the light in, breaking down compartmentalization, and breaking down the need to know would inevitably put in jeopardy the immigration if the Soviets should learn the extent of the activities. So this is, again, it's kind of the sources and methods argument. We can't really, air out or expose this very, important operation and relationship that we have going on, because if we did, it would put in jeopardy our relationship with the Israelis, and perhaps the immigration would be understood as being more detrimental to Soviet national security. So we just can't, as much as we'd love to share our secrets with the world so that we could have an informed democratic debate in the public, we just can't, because we would be losing all of this important intelligence that we're gathering about the Soviets, who are always plotting to take over the world and defeat us, and are quite serious about it, and really possibly able to do it if we're not really on our toes. I mean, the whole Cold War is absurd. Some dispute in connection with these matters, assuming Israeli matters, underlay your dispute with Mr. Colby, with which underlay your leaving the agency. He says, yes, he offered me jobs and whatnot, but these are matters of principle as far as I'm concerned. And then he's asked, were there points along the way where the U.S. interests and the interests of Israel were in conflict? Okay, so see, when they are asking this, it doesn't matter that they redact it. I mean, they redacted up here in this little passage. This page was redacted before. That's the reason you see these big black lines over it, because if you look at the document, the ones that weren't released previously, the older version, which is at places like Mary Farrell, you can see on this document, they have these big X's on the pages that weren't in the original. So it's pretty interesting to look at the two next to each other. And there's even one that was removed from the new release, which I will mention because I think that's significant. You almost wonder if they did that to highlight it. This is a strange piece. The things that are in it that are underlined, the fact that they released it, it's really amazing to me. And I hope maybe some people out there that have followed the documents of this area even more closely than me will be able to add some insights to it. We're planning to have Jeff Morley on next week, and we'll talk about this. So were there points along the way where U.S. interests and the interests of Israel were in conflict? Gosh, is it possible that they're not exactly the same? I mean, this is what Mearsheimer says all the time, that no two states have the same interests. And so, Israel has been able to bend the U.S. to its will. He attributes that to the Israel lobby. I would say that this clandestine part, and people have heard me say this on recent episodes if they've been paying attention, this clandestine aspect is likely a bigger part of the story than anyone recognizes, because we just don't know what kind of blackmail they have on the U.S. And I suspect the Kennedy assassination is a part of it for a number of reasons. So another one of the people questioning him, what I'm saying is he had an unusually close relationship with these people. Okay, and another person says, may I suggest Suez as a conflict that might have been one where the U.S. interest was not the same as the Israelis, because obviously the U.S. intervened on the side of Nasser when the British and French and Israelis tried to take over the Suez Canal because Nasser had nationalized it. Okay, another aspect here, which they go on a good bit about, and it would be worth looking at some of these other materials there. And the guy, Cruikshank, has some interesting materials on this. I don't think that the person that did the write-up on these has a solid handle on the bigger picture of the Kennedy assassination. And I think he may have written about it in relation to UFOs and such, which I'm also extremely skeptical of. And I do find it very odd that the first place that this document would come out would be on somebody who was writing about UFOs, but maybe that's part of why nobody else noticed it, to my knowledge, because it was, this person was kind of out there and, or just didn't have a big following. But a lot of his analysis is pretty interesting, and he did find some other good documents. So I really, if it is somehow related to aliens, then boy, I'll just be quite surprised about that, and I'd want to know if that's the case, but I don't know about that aspect of it. But mostly in the article that we're talking about here, that I got, that gave me this link to the document, he's talking about the bomb, and I think there's a lot here that's really important. So he's asked about this, and a lot of this is known. It's written about, I think the best write-up maybe in Jeff Morley's The Ghost, which I sadly don't have my hard copy of that anymore. I can't find it. I had the audiobook and a hard copy, and I couldn't find it the other day, so I wasn't able to read much of it. And I did talk to Jeff on the phone, and we'll talk to him more next week, so hopefully we'll get that sorted. But here's what he says. Has the Central Intelligence Agency directly or indirectly transferred any atomic technology or know-how to Israel? Must be. From my knowledge, the answer is an absolute no. Now, here you get into this issue, which I think is pretty fascinating. He says, okay, the beginning part of Angleton, he says, the answer is an absolute no. And then he said that would be one of those grounds that Mr. Miller was referring to where the agency in the person of John McCone had some of the sharpest words probably in the history of the relationship. So something related to the nuclear angle, which was very much against the policy of JFK. And John McCone was the CIA director under JFK. He was the one that replaced Allen Dulles. And he was apparently very unhappy about this. And as Angleton said, he used some of the sharpest words in the history of the Israeli-U.S. relationship to talk about this. And he's asked by a questioner, Mr. Swartz, you mentioned those at lunch. That's a lunch I would have liked to have sat in on. And you might just put that in the record. Okay, so he's putting it in the record. And so if you look at the bottom of the document here, there's a huge redaction. I would really like to know what that said. It would be good to know what John McCone was saying because, as I said, this was against Kennedy's policy. But if you read the Cruikshank article and you see that there were apparently relationships going back with some of these figures to the nuclear angle. So we'll come back to this a little bit more, but I'd really like to know what that was because it does seem that Angleton and the CIA, regarding this nuclear issue, were pursuing a policy that was completely opposed to what the president was saying, and it was that because it was authorized at a higher level back in the 50s under Eisenhower. It may well be. We'll come back to that. So there's this discussion of a guy named Tad Schulk, and he was a reporter, and he had written about the Bay of Pigs, and may have been one of the people who helped to leak that story, and let the Soviets figure out and the Cubans figure out what was going on. He's also the person who spoke to JFK about assassinations, and JFK said that he was basically testing him to see what he thought about assassinations, and that he was against them all. So that's an interesting story. I don't know Tad Schulk's angle. He seems to be intelligence connected on some level, but I don't really have a fleshed out theory as to exactly what he represented. But he is a character in this whole era of the 70s as well that revolves around sort of leak warfare, as I've discussed before. And this part to me is fascinating, and I'd like to learn more about it if I could. So they're talking about an article. It says Schulk says in this galley, this is a galley of the Schulk article in Penthouse. So when he says they're looking at a galley, that makes me think that the other article may have been changed, but maybe this is exactly the same as what was in the article that was published in Penthouse. This is one of the strange things about the 1970s is some of the most interesting and illuminating writing on things related to the clandestine state and covert action, CIA and all this was in these, skin magazines like Penthouse and Gallery. And now I think Gallery Books is still around, but it actually began as that, skin magazine. So here's what was written in the galley in Penthouse. Although the details of the Israeli nuclear enterprise are still top secret, it is known that in the wake of the 1956 Suez War, the Eisenhower administration resolved to provide Israel with all possible help in developing an atomic weapon. And the Israelis had the knowledge, but they needed some technological support in order to get the bomb. So this is really something if it's accurate. If it's accurate that Eisenhower perhaps has a way to say, okay, we're sorry, that you're unhappy about the way the Suez crisis shook out, but don't worry, we will help you to get a nuclear bomb. So when it says the Eisenhower administration, you have to wonder if this was something that was approved by Eisenhower or if this is something that figures in the national security state and elsewhere. They decided themselves that Israel would be able to get a bomb. This would be a very interesting question to know what kind of authorization there was for this. And if this is really the first time that this testimony has been discussed, it seems like that's something that journalists should be asking about. But of course, they'll tell us what they want to tell us. And if they want to keep it secret, they'll keep it secret because, we don't live in a democracy, obviously. According to the top intelligence sources, the CIA was charged with the responsibility of providing this support to the Israelis. So they ask Angleton, do you have any knowledge that the CIA was charged with this? And Angleton says, absolutely to the contrary. Well, and then Senator Tower comes in. Angleton directed the effort, quoting him. So Angleton says absolutely to the contrary. And that denial means absolutely nothing because this guy is one of the most dishonest human beings on the planet. And at the end of his life, he essentially said, he basically affirmed my assessment of him when he said, we felt like we were the kings of the world back then, but we're surely going to hell for the crimes that we committed. I'm paraphrasing, but he said that in essence. Now, Sidney Gottlieb makes an appearance here, which is fascinating. At one point, when these characters are, um, at one point when the reporters like Cy Hirsch and Tad Schulk are talking to people like Angleton, and they're trying to, ask him about some of these things or get confirmation of some of the things that they've uncovered. They try, especially Tad Schulk, tries to impress Angleton or make him think that he has some really high level source. So he asks him, "Do you know who is bicycling in India?" And that Angleton says, "As I said, I'm afraid I'm not with you. I don't know." And then Schulk says, "Sidney X." And Sidney X is one of our most sensitive employees who retired and is bicycling in India. So he's saying this cryptic thing like, "Do you know who's bicycling in India?" Which sounds like some corny spy thing or something. And he says, "Sidney X." And then the response from Angleton is that he's one of our most sensitive employees who retired and is bicycling in India because, Gottlieb was such a sick weirdo and he was into this new age stuff and, into different Eastern religions and went to India. But, he, of course, oversaw these experiments on humans for like mind control and other terrible things. So, very strange guy. Now, that man's name, this is Angleton, that man's name is Sidney Gottlieb, and he was the head of our technical services department, which means that there's a cross plant in our business. And the man who was bugging and performing all the hundreds of technical services has access, unfortunately, to many of our operations. So this is a way to say that this Gottlieb angle and the fact that Schulk knows who he is worrisome because he's thinking if that's possibly the source for some of this stuff, then that's bad because there's a person who knows a lot. So this is one juncture in the business where there's a breakdown in compartmentalization. For him to indicate that he knew Gottlieb and the sources that had been raised, and then there's a redaction, to be in our technical services division, which if he was, he would know everything or he could get into everything. Technical services division, they handle what you would think technical services. And these were, their resources were drawn upon by E. Howard Hunt and the plumbers when they went to Watergate. So there's a lot going on with these in these offices. Was there any conversation in which Schulk or Hirsch talked to Colby about these matters? Did you ever get any impression that they were implying that Colby was their source? Okay, because Colby seems to have wanted to bring about the end of Angleton's reign at counterintelligence. And so the question is, was it Colby who was telling them about these people like Gottlieb and so on, and was doing it as part of a way to get to Angleton and to eventually get Angleton to have to resign or be fired? So another aspect of this, which to me is really fascinating, is Bill Harvey, the Cuban business, and the, Israel account. Okay. And this part is a tad confusing to me to figure out exactly what they're saying. I mean, I know the chronology. I know the Six-Day War is in 1967. And they say, after the Six-Day War, this would be Angleton, the Soviets sent out a barrage of propaganda in Arabic to the Middle East from Audio Moscow and the CIA, or Radio Moscow, maybe it's supposed to say, that the CIA, and they mentioned Bill Harvey, who was working for us, and whom I put in touch with blank during the Cuban business. Okay, presumably the Israeli account during the Cuban business. So they'd met on a ship with somebody who had a background in the war with the Israelis and had met there and prepared and carried out all the strategic part of the Six-Day War. And this is all PFIS, Portfolio Israel, maybe? Is that what that means? The Israeli account? I think that may be what it means, but I could be totally wrong about PFIS. There's a tremendous pike of Soviet materials, and they never got much into our media because it's directed to the Middle East and Arabic. Okay. They used Harvey's name instead of my name because professionally we were very close and more important. So they're saying, they're talking about the CIA and its role. The Soviets are releasing information on the CIA and the U.S. role in 1967, perhaps, and the connection between the CIA and Israel. And the person that they mentioned in this sort of Soviet release is Harvey. So he says, because we are very close and more important, I had introduced Harvey as the only officer to the blank on the Cuban business, presumably the Israeli account on the Cuban business. Earlier, you mentioned that you put Harvey in touch with the blank during the Cuban business. And we've had a lot of testimony about Mr. Harvey. and we're well aware of his activities. William Harvey is the guy that ran ZR Rifle, which was the plans to assassinate Castro, and assassination apparatus, basically, where he talks about, oh yeah, we're going to need to like have a patsy in place so that we can pin this on the communists if need be, for these things. Okay, so he's asked, we know who Mr. Harvey is, and we have a fair amount of testimony about some of the things he had done. What was the connection between him and the Israeli account during the Cuban business? Angleton says he'll put it briefly, but then Tower interjects, what is the Cuban business specifically? And then Schwartz says, the witness used the expression Cuban business. I guess I should ask first, what do you mean by the Cuban business? Second, what's the connection between Mr. Harvey and the Israeli account on this matter? What is the connection between the Cuban business and William Harvey and the Israelis? And then somebody else even also tries to clarify, what is the importance of putting him in touch with them in relation to Cuba? What is the importance of putting Harvey in touch with the Israelis in relation to Cuba? It's a very good question. Angleton says, Bill Harvey was put in touch of taking over the Cuban business. Cuban business being the clandestine services activity into Cuba. Okay, so that explains what the Cuban business is. And we know what we know what Harvey was up to there. There's Mongoose and ZR Rifle and these Castro assassination plots. And he also says he didn't have any part in the Bay of Pigs because he had differences with Bissell, one of the guys who was fired by JFK afterwards. And it seemed to me that both the Cubans and the Soviets knew everything about the Bay of Pigs. So this is interesting, and it does raise the question, who leaked all of this? Could it possibly have been the Israelis who leaked it? I don't know if that's what they're implying or not. I don't even know if that makes much sense, but people have always speculated as to why that operation failed. And some people even believe that parts of the deep state wanted it to fail because the Cuban government, the communist Cuban government, was useful as a way to justify intervention all over Latin America. I don't know if that's plausible or not, but it was a dumb mission and it had no chance to succeed as it was. I think that they actually wanted Kennedy to intervene, but people can debate that if they want. Okay, Bill Harvey, Cuban business, and again, the Israeli account. So when Bill took over the Cuban business, then I decided that since we were very good friends, that I would try to help him out by getting him a source totally unknown to everybody. This is interesting, right? The Israeli account, and then he knows somebody totally unknown to anybody because he handles the Israeli account. And these liaison arrangements are very sensitive and highly compartmentalized. So Angleton really had a lot of power here. I went to the Israeli account, the Mossad, and I had them assign a man to Havana who I happen to know very well, and then a big redaction, which I sure would like to know what it says. He was sent to Havana, which meant that here he was, and the communications were from him in a one-time pattern. I mean, total security from Havana to Mossad, I guess, to me, and from me to Bill. And no one knew of his existence or his identity except Harvey and myself, and of course, Dick Helms, which is very notable. Dick Helms is another person who I think is one of the top CIA suspects in the JFK assassination. In fact, he probably, I would wager that he was the highest ranking person in the CIA who was a witting part of the JFK assassination, I would imagine. Now, one interesting thing about the document that was released and the previous document is that this document, the less redacted one, is missing one page out of it, but that page is actually available on the version of the document with more redactions, which is you can get at Mary Farrell. So that to me is fascinating. And then it raises the question, well, is this like an oversight that they took this out, or did they take it out for some reason, or did they take it out almost to make it seem more noticeable? I don't really know. I would really like to know why this is missing, but let's look at some of the things that are in this document, which people probably commented on in the past, and maybe a part of the basis of why people have talked about Angleton and Israel in relation to the Kennedy assassination in the past and the nuclear issue. So here's what he says. The Schwartz, who's one of the questioners, says, the use of the Israeli man was something that you wanted to keep highly compartmentalized. And Angleton says, yeah, it could jeopardize everything. It was a concomitant to everything. And then Angleton is asked, comment on the likelihood that the information might not have been passed to Mr. McCone. Okay, this information about the Israeli angle I have to take, because Angleton asked what information, that we were using the Israeli agent. Okay, so how likely is it that John McCone, the director of the CIA, might have not known about the Israeli involvement in these Cuban operations? So Angleton says, well, I think he knew that. And Schwartz says, in connection with you? And Angleton says, I don't think, I'll put it this way, that not knowing him personally on an espionage deal of this source, I don't think Mr. McCone would want to be bothered to begin with. It looks big to you today, but when you think of what the agency's efforts were at the time in the Miami base with all the boats and the biggest Navy in the world and all the rest, a little thing involving one man was not a thing that you went up and made a fuss to Mr. McCone about. So considering that Angleton previously says that Mr. McCone had some of the most angry words in the history of the CIA-Mossad relationship in regards to the nuclear issue and the CIA's involvement in it, you have to wonder what Angleton is doing here. I mean, you have to think he's possibly lying or trying to cover his ass by saying that, well, if McCone didn't know about these things, it's probably because it's such a minor matter, not really that important, but it's important enough for him to be asking about it. And McCone, judging by his response to the nuclear issue with Israel, he may have been kind of infuriated by it. And then, this raises a question of who all was witting about all of the aspects of the assassination plots as well. It's there's a lot, it's pregnant with implications, all of this. So that's interesting that one was omitted from the new release. Now, Bill Harvey and the Mafia, this is another angle that's really significant, because this is what Harvey is known for. He puts together the ZR rifle, assassination unit, but he's also known for working with mobsters and people like Johnny Rosselli. So they ask Angleton, did you know anything about Harvey's use of underworld figures in connection with the assassination plots, assuming, because he kind of interrupts here, but I think Angleton wants to interrupt because he may not want him to even say it. I know the allegations, and at the time, did you know that? I only know of one incident. Okay, simply the Bureau, the FBI, and surveillance. Okay, they're talking about one incident in which Bill Harvey was involved with the underworld. Now, this is, I think, very implausible. It strains credulity beyond the breaking point when he says, I knew of one incident. Okay, like Harvey was just this, free agent out there doing whatever he wanted, or a loose cannon. I don't buy that at all, given everything we know about Angleton and his connections. So it tells a story about how he was seen with Rosselli, essentially, that Bill Harvey was seen with Rosselli, and that the CIA basically tells the FBI to back off. So that Schwartz says, that was Mr. Rosselli, was it? And Angleton says, I think it was. And the Bill you speak of here is Bill Harvey. Yes, Bill Harvey. Now, it is a lot of the conventional version of the history of these plots is that it was Robert Mayhew who approached the Mafia in order to establish this CIA Mafia connection. That may be a cover story of sorts. It may be a limited hangout of sorts. I think that these relationships went back further, and that there was a more of a modus vivendi with the Mafia and the CIA. And to my mind, the Lansky Syndicate and Israel have connections that are very relevant to all of this. That, to me, is hanging over the background and really is a big part of this time period in history, especially the clandestine history, because it's known that Lansky was someone who helped the Israelis win their war of independence, and he eventually retires to Israel, and it's a very fascinating angle, and it raises the question of is the Israeli account, is part of the Israeli account really the management of the relationship between the Lansky Syndicate, because the Italian Mafia seems to be people like Santo Trafficante and Sam Giancana and Carlos Marcello. They seem to be subordinated to the bigger, the syndicate, which was previously Luciano and Lansky, especially Lansky later on. So I think that it is very much debatable as to whether that issue of the Mayhew involvement in the assassination plots was fully was the whole story, I am skeptical of it, and I do think that there may be a lot more to this relationship. Like, I don't think it seems not a coincidence that Lansky had all of these connections to Israel and to Mossad, and that it was people who were subordinate to him, essentially, as I understand it, in the organized crime hierarchy that they use for these assassination plots, with some of the same people like Bill Harvey. Something that we should learn a lot more about if we're able to. So here, more on Harvey, the Mafia, and the Israeli desk. Mr. Angleton, to your specific knowledge, did Bill ever attempt to use the excellent contact he had in Havana to carry out the mission of eliminating the leader down there, or try to get any help out of him in that regard? So this is really getting right at the heart of it, I think. Is this something that he did? Did he try to take advantage of this in terms of the assassinations? It's more or less asking about what I was implying, that perhaps this Israeli angle and not the Robert Mayhew conventional narrative would help to explain how this got established in Cuba, and how it may have been, later redirected against President Kennedy. Now, this part here, Angleton says he knows that I would have cut his throat. Okay. And then Mr. Kerbaus, another one of the questioners, says that would have jeopardized your entire contact with the Israeli, with the Mossad. Angleton says, yes, sir. I believe that must be what he says about this. So this, to me, is very significant, because what are the chances that Angleton is telling the truth here? I really would be skeptical of this when he says, I would have cut his throat. I really doubt that Angleton would have been opposing the assassination of Castro. And Angleton seems to be so close to Israel that you wonder if he would have tried to help Israel in terms of involving them in these kind of sensitive things, because it would give Israel even more power to move things in a direction that Angleton liked. Because as we see now, the hardline realpolitik Zionists are they have a pretty crazy worldview. Like, they have they believe in a greater Israel. I mean, as Jeffrey Sachs always spells this out, and he says that this became more of this achieved a critical mass after the 1967 war. But I have to guess that these people, when you look back at people like David Ben Gurion and how much they regarded any assistance to the Palestinians as a huge threat to them, I don't know that the elite Zionists ever had any intention of allowing a Palestinian state to be established. I have serious doubts that they ever did. And so they would have been the perfect people, because they're the most committed to Fortress America, America as the unipolar empire of the world, because that's the only way that Israel can achieve greater Israel, that they can achieve their insane biblical pipe dream of having a greater Israel. So, I think that's important to keep in mind. Another aspect of this testimony, which is really why why I'm spending so much time on it, because it just deals with all these issues that I've tried to talk about in the past and written about in the past, is Watergate and James McCord. So Baker asks about this. Two parts of the question. One, do you know of any agency involvement of those who were working with the agency in the Watergate, in your breakup or the preparation for the cover-up or the attempted cover-up? And Angleton says, my answer is I do not. But he does say, I know Jim McCord extremely well. And he says about McCord, he was a man that had a very difficult case abroad, which meant that it had to be buried, no leakages. And I used him twice, and one was a pretty lengthy use of him, and he followed instructions to the letter. He strayed on the one, and it is not important. It is just something that he did. It is just something that he did, something that wasn't very wise. This part is fascinating to me, because what is he getting at? Why is he saying that he's making this cryptic allusion to some bad thing that McCord did? And that's interesting to me. Now, I want to talk about John Newman, and I've heard Newman speak about how something in McCord's behavior is strange, and that he hypothesizes that McCord may have been a mole in some way. And this I thought was one of the strangest things that I'd heard, that he says that the behavior of McCord, in regards to some of these mole hunts and other things, suggests that maybe McCord was compromised or was a mole. Now, what I would wonder about is if this is some sort of reference to this, if somehow, because the way that Angleton is talking about it, it's like he knows that there's some sort of screw up, and is it somehow related to what John Newman might be talking about? And to my mind, I have a hard time believing that McCord could be compromised by the Soviets and be a Soviet mole. But I wonder if what Newman is pointing to has some kind of Israeli connection. If McCord somehow became compromised or otherwise, perhaps through Angleton, perhaps Angleton even set him up in some way to have him compromised by Israel. If that might explain some of these mysteries around McCord. And that's just a hunch, but you really wonder about this. This seems pregnant with implication, and I hope that people can do a little bit more investigating into it. So they're asking him about why McCord did what he did and went into the Watergate, and Angleton said, I can't understand it. I would say it was ideological with him. There wasn't any difficulty in understanding his views on a given subject. Meaning that McCord was a very straightforward kind of right-winger, very ideological. That's what I take that to mean. And if you've ever looked into some of the things he wrote about Watergate or said about Watergate, they're pretty nuts. I mean, he wrote this weird memoir called a Piece of Tape, and he talks about how Nixon was attempting to basically become the new Hitler or something like that, and it evinces a very strange and kind of fascistic view of the national security state, really, even though he's saying that Nixon wants to become a Hitler. I take that to mean that he believes that it was wrong of Nixon to take into the presidency and into the executive office the dirty tricks. So the things that McCord was actually doing when they break into the Watergate, although Nixon doesn't seem to have endorsed that or planned that, even still, it seems that McCord thinks it's a matter of principle that the national security bureaucracy and bureaucrats like himself, lifelong spooks, not elected by anyone, should really be the ones in charge of deciding when the law is to be broken. They should basically be in charge of the exception to the rule of law, and they should be the ones in charge of the dirty tricks rather than the president. Now, I think it's kind of scary to think of the president using the clandestine state in order to advance his own political fortunes, which seems to be what Nixon was doing. Nixon, in his own mind, would have said that it was for national security that he was doing these things because, the Democrats might be boosted by Moscow or Cuba or whatever. I mean, that's ridiculous. But if you stop and think about it, what does it mean if you have the president not in charge of the clandestine state? I mean, the CIA is supposed to work at the president's wish. They're supposed to serve the president and the National Security Council, which the president heads, right? That's what the operations arm does. It's supposed to carry out these other things from time to time that the National Security Council tells it to do. And that just means all these insane covert operations. But if you don't say that the president should have control of this, then you're saying it should be basically permanent dictatorial exceptionalist part of the national security state. So with no democratic sanction at all, really, no elected official at all in charge of all these secrets and this criminal apparatus. This is not an anti-fascist point of view at all. It's a kind of even scarier fascism in a sense, because you're talking about these fascist powers being given not to an elected official, but to an unelected set of bureaucrats operating in total secrecy. Now, regarding McCord and the Watergate, where he seems to have bungled it so badly to get caught on purpose, and I am pretty confident that that's what happened, that him bungling things in the Watergate was a way to put the pressure on Nixon and to potentially undermine Nixon if he ever were to try to go at the CIA, especially if he was going to fire Helms and so on, which he did. And McCord said, if you ever fire Helms, it'll be a scorched desert and every tree in the forest will fall. That's really significant. So anyway, they're asking him about McCord's equipment. The equipment that was used was a fairly primitive sort for that sort of operation. And then Angleton says, that's what I read, and that surprised me also. Oh, okay. Why was he surprised about this? Well, here, listen, this is later on. Instead of using anybody in the clandestine side, I took McCord and the group and sent them to that country. He's talking about a previous case where he used McCord trying to use that to explain this issue of the equipment. I sent him to that country for 6 or 7 weeks. So McCord has great knowledge of he knows the counter electronics. So he knows how to do surveillance and he knows how to do counter surveillance. He's a professional. As McCord, in Jim Hogan's book, Secret Agenda, he writes about Angleton saying of McCord was an operator, meaning McCord's not just a technician. He's not just a guy you send in. He's like a serious intelligence operator. And here he's saying that he has all this knowledge of counter electronics. I don't know why he bungled everything at the Watergate so badly. But the questions that they're asking here are fascinating. They're asking him about why McCord seems to have bungled this, I think with the implication being that did he do this on purpose or something? Why would he do something so amateurish? And they're asking, previously about Bill Harvey and Israel and the Castro assassination plots. Like, this is also very fascinating. He was familiar with the most exotic sources of intelligence gathering, and that's why Angleton says precisely, and that's why I can't understand this. So there you go. And the last part of this that I do want to speak of is Angleton's anti-detente paranoia. He says here near the end, he's talking about what he sees as the problems with the agency and U.S. National security policy in an era of detente. He says, we're living in a dream world where here, in terms of the Soviets, and time is short, it is detente. And it is all the fallacious kind of discussions and arguments one hears on the subject. And we have to come at it, through our hard realism and not wishful thinking. I'm paraphrasing there. And then he says, our views are shared by professionals all through the Western world, and they laugh at the U.S. in terms of what detente has done. But what it has done to the intelligence services or to the FBI is only a shadow of what it once was. And so there isn't any real internal security protection. This is where, again, you see the affinity between Angleton and the Israelis, and why he is sort of like a proto-neocon, perhaps. And the significance of this is that Watergate, as I have argued, and based on Peter Dale Scott's work, and I think I expand on it and add some new angles to it in American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State, is that the whole outcome of the 60s assassinations, but then it leads to Vietnam and the end of the Bretton Woods system, and that gets balanced by dealing with the oil shocks and later the Volcker shocks. But Nixon was someone who was for detente. Nixon and Kissinger wanted to have a relaxed way to relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union to be able to kind of manage the post-Vietnam era, and rather than trying to destroy the Soviet Union. But which is what the rollback people wanted to do. They wanted to roll back communism. On the other, and then you had containment, people who wanted the status quo. Eventually, you have people who wanted detente. So the position of people vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in the Cold War was a key political feature of everybody at the time, and it kind of defined other aspects of where they stood politically. So this is notable. It's notable that Watergate, getting rid of Nixon, and then you have Ford in there, and he has the Halloween massacre in 1975, where he fires Kissinger as the national security advisor, and they drop the moderate Nelson Rockefeller as a VP for the next election, and they fire William Colby as CIA director, and they replace him with George H.W. Bush, who's not really a neocon, but he's more of a American imperialist right-wing person, like the old sort of. I mean, Rockefeller is considered more of a liberal, perhaps, and then Bush might conventionally be considered more of a conservative. But I think that the pro-empire corporate American oligarch people and their political legmen like Bush, so I consider like Rockefeller, H.W. Bush, people like Dean Acheson as being this kind of waspy establishment. And what comes to power after the Halloween massacre, and really it takes I think it assumes its mature form after Reagan, is this kind of new neocon consensus about foreign policy and in the Soviet Union. And they eventually do go for rollback, and they succeed. They bring down the Soviet Union. But Watergate and getting rid of Nixon, it wasn't recognized at the time, but that was not a victory for liberalism or liberal Democrats. At the time, I believe that the Kennedy wing of the Democrats and the Democrats in general were happy to see Nixon go. He was considered a villain. And they made a kind of common cause with people who were more right-wing figures. And the end result is that we see a big shift to the right in American politics that really gets consolidated with Reagan and his election in 1980. And since then, every president has been Reagan. And that has been why we have all of these political problems, because it's both parties are pro-corporate and anti democracy in terms of like looking out for the interests of the majority of the American people. It's a big part of why we have all these political nightmares basically in the US. So is this more confirmation of my theses, which I lay out in American Exception, Empire and the Deep State? I think so, and I'm going to try to explain why. The deep events of the 60s and 70s involved forces that would become known as neoconservatives and neoliberals. The murders of the 1960s neutralized progressive internationalism in the US. Once you get rid of JFK and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and RFK, and Martin Luther King and RFK are killed within months of each other in 1968, when it seems like there's a kind of revolutionary feeling in the US politically. And then they just kill these people, and the result is Nixon, a very not revolutionary president. Okay, Watergate involved anti-détente figures like James McCord, but also pro-détente figures like Rockefeller man David Young. So Watergate is a very interesting thing. It involved liberal Democrats and then corporate liberal people like, Rockefeller man David Young, and, even Kissinger would be a part of that administration. And he seems to have been, there on the margins in a weird way. People like Haig seem to be anti-détente people. Kissinger's in Watergate, Kissinger's role is weird, and he kind of comes out of it clean somehow. Which same with David Young. David Young ends up in a sinecure somehow. So I think that is telling. The aftermath of Watergate eliminated the nationalistic American right. That's what I see Nixon as partially representing conservatives, but conservatives who are actually, I don't want to call them America first, but they are pro-American, and they're pro-American manufacturing and such. So Nixon, as president, tried to accommodate hawkish people who would be called neocons later. So there were, of course, these very hard right militarist forces. Some of them tried to spy on Nixon, like during the Moore-Radford affair. Nixon, I think, was tricked into basically having one of these people, Alexander Haig, as his chief of staff. You wouldn't think of him necessarily as a neocon, but he was a more conservative militarist guy, and he was somebody who was close to Kissinger, but also close to these right-wing generals who were spying on Kissinger, right-wing officers. He tried to accommodate pro-détente, neoliberals. That's where I would put Kissinger and Rockefeller more firmly. In that camp. American nationalists, so domestic manufacturers and labor. I mean, he gets the endorsement from the Teamsters, and I believe he releases Jimmy Hoffa too, which is interesting. And he even tried to accommodate liberal reformers to some degree. I mean, Nixon presided over an expansion of the Voting Rights Act and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. He was a person who actually presided over an increase in the regulatory powers of the federal government, and that is very much against what came after him. And so it suggests to me that this new kind of, Reaganomics and deregulation and all this, that Nixon was not for that, and this general orientation of Nixon to accommodate American nationalism in terms of economics and such, and détente. These were reasons that the right had thought that he had to go, and that ultimately I think Watergate was a right-wing coup when it came down to it, and that we can see this by looking at who ended up benefiting from it and what replaces it. What replaces Nixon ultimately in the Republican Party? It's Reaganism. And if you think of it today, it's pretty fascinating to look at this. We have a three-man race, and I would say that Joe Biden really represents the the Reagan neocon neoliberal consensus. I mean, he is a neocon foreign policy he's for all these neoliberal policies that we've had since Reagan and with Clinton and so on. I mean, he's a corporate Democrat and a neocon on foreign policy, essentially. He hasn't pulled the troops out of Syria or Iraq, even when the governments ask us to go, and we're illegally in Syria. He's backing Israel to the hilt as they carry out the Gaza genocide and attack Iran and attack Iran's embassy, in all violation of international law. On the other side, you have Trump, and Trump did not, as president, really reverse the neocon consensus. He challenged some neoliberal tenets by, for example, putting up tariffs and such like that. And he tried to make noises about wanting to help American manufacturing. So he seems to want to benefit from being seen as a pro-American manufacturing person, pro-American industry, like a vaguely America First type person at this time. So I think that's a part of why the deep state really hates Trump, in part, is that he's not really good for the American global dominance project. He's not a very good front man because he's, kind of a repellent figure really to the rest of the world. And so this is he's a strange, he seems to represent part of those political forces that were kicked out of the American political class after Watergate. And I think that is notable. And I can't say exactly what he represents in total, but, he's a strange figure. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. seems also to embrace a little bit of that American nationalism of Nixon. And because that was a kind of a liberal thing to be concerned about American manufacturing and so on. He represents, in some ways, the progressive internationalism that was eliminated with the assassinations of the 1960s, but with, of course, one huge caveat, which is his support for the state of Israel. So I think all of these issues about the political factions that came to power to create this new consensus, and that consensus is breaking down. And some of these forces that we see that were eliminated with the assassinations of the 60s and with Watergate, they seem to be coming back to challenge Biden, who really represents the Reagan, the post-Reagan establishment in the United States. And it will be very interesting to see how this plays out and if these forces will eventually come to power as the American unipolar dominance project fails, which it seems to be failing, pretty spectacularly right now. So I hope everybody appreciated this review of the newly less redacted testimony of James Jesus Angleton from the Church Committee in 1975. I found the whole thing fascinating, and I don't think that it had been released before. I sent it to Peter, and he wants me to send this to Mary Farrell, so they'll put it up there, and I'll send it to other people here too as well. So hopefully some other people can take a crack at this and figure out what things that I might have missed. So I hope you appreciate that. I know it's a lot of detail over some documents. I hope it wasn't too dry or pedantic, but I did find it fascinating, and I thought that people could benefit from having someone analyze it who spent a whole lot of time looking at these episodes in the deep political history of the United States. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. You can rent or buy the For Died Trying prologue now on Amazon and other streaming platforms. Chapter 1 is also available now. Visit fordiedtrying.com for details. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast. I hope that everyone appreciated the discussion with Larry Wilkerson and my examination of the newly less redacted Church Committee testimony of the notorious CIA counterintelligence chief, James Angleton. Look at Ukraine and Gaza today and think about Vietnam, Watergate eras, and these people like Biden and Netanyahu and James Angleton. You, me, and really the billions of human beings outside of the circles of power. To these deep state functionaries, we're all just pawns on the devil's chessboard.